Hello, and welcome to another Imperfectly Perfect Conversation for the Flourishing Education podcast. Today, I bring to you my new guest, Dr. Zachery Spire. A very warm welcome to the podcast.
Fabian, thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to being here.
Yes, wonderful. So, for the listeners, before I ask the first question that I always ask my guests uh, to obviously share, like ask Zach to share in the same way. I just want to say I had the utter privilege of meeting Zach at the BERA conference last year.
Mm.
And BERA, for those of you who don't know, is the British Educational Research Association. So I'm sure in the conversation we'll talk more about that, but I just want to preface obviously this conversation with the fact that we've spent some time together, and so I know you. Sometimes I don't know my guests, but that said, for our listeners who may not know who Dr. Spire is, would you tell us a little bit more about you, Zach? So, where are you in the world?
Mm.
Who are you? I've said your name, but and what's been your
Mm.
journey so far in education?
Yeah, for sure. So in the world, I'm currently in Portland, Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. I'm a research specialist at this time at Oregon State University. And my work the last 2 years has been focused on public and community engagement. So, looking at the ways in which the university relates to towns, cities, regions, the state broadly. And I got here after spending some time in Stanford before Oregon State. I was working in student housing and student residences. And my background originally, before then, was in the study of student residences and student engagement. My previous work in the UK and the Netherlands was focused on the study of student residences and the influence of student residences for participation and student sense of being and their sense of transformation in participating in both residences and university. And that was kind of the logical outcome of me having spent a good deal of energy as an undergraduate and then as a master's student studying and working in different student residences as a student myself. Um, and I think, as you mentioned, we met at BIRA last year because a colleague of mine, Emily Bastable, who's at the University of Southampton, and I were presenting on public and community engagement and the ways in which it's presented and understood in the UK compared to the United States. And I think that we emerged from a conversation where I was visiting actually your session and sort of trying to understand what it is your work entailed. So yeah, that's how I think we got to be sitting at this table now.
Yes, and yeah, it was just a lovely encounter. I particularly loved post like sessions. So as part of the BERA, I presented for the first time my PhD plans.
Mm.
And so having your like what I really loved about that session in particular is like when you've been planning to do something and then you suddenly take it out to the world for like critique or it's just really lovely to then get feedback from people and to and also I felt really privileged because that session was with as part of that was my supervisor was presenting her work, and then other two other colleagues were also there from the university. So it felt like a really supportive way of, or supported way of sharing what is about what I'm about to embark on, actually, because I'm about to start the field work in the schools.
Mm.
Exciting.
Mm. Yeah, I think also like it's I think it's so important we still have moments to be able to do that and to do it in a supportive environment, especially as a lot of universities and higher education, postgraduate researchers and taught research students are engaging with this world where the broader rhetoric and discourse is how artificial intelligence and how the university's purpose and the meaning of the university in societies, and that broader discussion, and how do you bring your work as a student into the world and ask for feedback and do it in a constructive and collaborative and sort of cooperative way, and really use that opportunity for, I don't know, Fabian, maybe we say critique or just contribution to questions about how you look at your work and position your work, and how invaluable it is still to do that with people.
Mm, yeah, and I think, you know, like your work around looking at the community piece and like the role of the university, and you know, student accommodation and students, and particularly like student sort of being and becoming, I think I
Mm,
really resonates with, um, because the relational piece I think
mm,
is so essential, right? Like it's almost, to me it's so obvious that, and so simple, that we often like completely not like miss it. Does that make sense to you, that like we almost miss the relational piece?
100%. Sorry, but like 100%. And I think this is why our conversation is so interesting to me, because we both look at the relationships as the primary, if you will, dimension, to use the work of Professor Ian Solomonides out of Australia. It's a work of Ronald Barnett. I mean, I think it was Barnett and Roy Bhaskar, the late Roy Bhaskar out of the Institute of Education, who was very sort of central to my thinking that, higher education is a human social activity. And so, if the human social is the central sort of way in which you frame how we will do or participate in the work, and think about it, because really it's a matter of how we frame it, and framing it is really a matter of how we bring ourselves to thinking about it and then express how we think about it in the world with each other. Yeah. And I think this relational aspect is so vital, because we don't know the value of it until we take our attention away from it, until it falls or drifts out of our awareness. And then when it drifts out of our awareness, we kind of treat it as a sort of like, if you will, like the thing that's nice to know, but not necessarily part of what we focus on. And
Mm,
I think we need to think about this intentionally, especially as we ask ourselves. I mean, I will just give away my position. I think that the position of the university is to be a social institution, to use the work of the British Sociological Association, to act as part of the social infrastructure of our societies, and to be sort of, if you will, um, liminal spaces where people feel liberated to ask questions and engage with ideas. And not that it's low stakes, but that it's stakes to the degree which you give it value. It's not a low stakes experience. It's a huge amount of time and energy and effort often for people. But I think this relational piece is really fundamental, because I believe, sort of fundamentally, if you will, that how you treat yourself becomes how you reflect in the world. And asking oneself, how am I treating myself? How is my being? How is my being, as you say, as you become something? That sense of being and sense of transformation as becoming something, and how that still requires or relies and is underpinned by our time together and our work together.
yes, yeah. And you know what I'm hearing in what you're saying, so I love the word liminal spaces, that they're, for me, they the way I experience liminal spaces is very often I love more than anything in the world to go on a walk with my dog on my own at dawn and dusk, when it's still like that edge between um dark and light. I love them. Okay, so this is for me, when I hear you use words like liminal space or spaces, this is
Mm,
what the image that it conjures in my mind.
mm.
Would you tell me what liminal space or spaces are for you, or is?
I think that's a beautiful way of describing it, as the dusk and the dawn. Um, I often talk. I have a good friend, Pablo. He and I used to take walks in the gardens of Bloomsbury when I was a student in London, and we would have coffee talks, and we would take walks, um, and those were our liminal times, the times where there's no agenda, the spaces with no set expectations around that we get to a particular place. We're just going with each other on a walk. And for me, liminal spaces is that it's the opportunity to spend time in in places and in spaces with people whereby my interest is just being with them and talking about things that we find a mutual affinity over. And I mean, if you're uh, our colleague, Dr. Luke Macron up at Imperial, he looks at liminal spaces as things like corridors or as atriums, as the intermediating spaces between formal and non-formal defined academic spaces, where people, where the formality of it all doesn't fall away completely, but the difference in authority and relationality changes so that students feel like they can express themselves. Students relate to their professors or um, their teachers in different, more just humane ways, driven more by the questions rather than the position of the people in these sort of like if you will, situatedness of the professor on stage and the student in the lecture theatre, in the classroom seat. And I think of liminal spaces as those places where I can have those human conversations, where I don't have any specific attachment to the outcome of the discussion, but I'm intentionally having the discussion. And I want that to be something that's mutually valuable to everybody at the table or everybody that we're with. Um, and I really like those places because I have found not that I accomplish things in them, as it were, that I can then put on a resume or a CV or talk about in some conference presentation or paper, but I get to be a person with friends, and that refills my cup to continue to try to be a person um, with people who I appreciate and love. Um, People who like Tom Lowe at the University of Westminster or Professor Bo Kellestein at the University of Warwick. Like these are people who always make time in whatever space they can for me, and I have benefited immensely as a person from that opportunity to participate with them. Mm.
And again, like I resonate so deeply with what you just shared, because for me, like the podcast, I call them imperfectly perfect conversations for that specific reason, right?
Mm.
And also when I was talking about liminal spaces, like going on the walk with my dog and like that in between like the darkness and the light, because for me it just looks like it's those paradoxical um you know split paradigms, that sort of like the dichotomies that you suddenly realize, well, you need one for the other. Like if you don't have light, you don't know what darkness is. And as I'm hearing you speak, so, and I also call my walks with the dog my wandering wanderings, So I use my walking to have a dialogue with myself,
Mm,
a reflection, to reflect on what's happened and what's triggered me or what's been a challenge. And that's why I call
mm,
them wandering wanderings. And so one thing I would love you to talk to is this, what you're describing or what we're talking about, like those liminal spaces. It feels slightly opposed to what perhaps we perceive formal education to be, right? So, like you were
mm,
talking about a professor, like a sage on the stage, and the students are receiving, right? Like our formal education system in many Western countries are based on that, on like there is a sage on the stage that's going to fill this empty vessel with their knowledge. It's very hierarchical. It's
mm.
very you were saying there's no intent, well, like there's intention, but there's no set agenda or like destination with my conversations and the dialogue and the coffee, like talking coffees you're having with your, if that's what you call them. Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you talk to me about that? Because to me, it feels slightly almost diametrically opposed.
Mm.
And in a way, a bit like the dawn and the dusk, or like the day and night. It's almost like it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both and, right?
Yeah, and I think it's both and. It's almost like the perfectly imperfect conversation is a liminal space for us because there's this understanding that it's not just the diametric we experience may just be as a matter of convention and convenience, not as a reflection of how people are being in those spaces. I have to acknowledge that as well. In the background of the discussion is I think the sage on stage or the reliance on the Socratic method in our environments, on this expectation of the dialogic between the people who are positioned within these
Would
spaces.
you explain like that Socratic, like, because but the listeners might not, like some of the listeners might think, oh, I don't know what he means. So would you explain that?
Sure, like for me, the Socratic method is kind of based on the expectation, a la Socrates, um, that we are in a debate, a dialogic about the ideas where we are sharing what we understand, and we are trusting that we are in spaces where others are sharing what they understand, and in that we are co-creating a mutual common ground of understanding between and with each other. Yeah. And so for me, there's this expectation of kind of like, well, the tutorial system is often also held up in this regard because there's an expectation of the student going to express or explain the argument as they understood it and then defend their interpretation as they explain out what it is they've learned. And so you have this kind of like, it's why we use the term engagement, right? Engagement is a derivative of the French noun engage, engagé. I mean, I don't know. I am not I'm not French. I am not fluent in French. This is a very sort of like American interpretation of this. But you you remember that that is an employment or an agreement to participate, and that the Socratic method is a way for us to understand how we will come and agree to participate, and that you know the the way that that structures the environment so that we have a kind of departure point and an arrival point, if you will, in the conversation, and that we acknowledge that everybody is in a different level of expertise as we're going. We're all to one degree or another a novice and an expert in something. And, I mean, I have this debate all the time with colleagues that I think, especially in the current state of higher education in the world and our understanding of spaces for higher education in the world, that it isn't dichotomous anymore. We've allowed a lot of um, how would you say, a lot of I would not, I don't know. I think you have to be very careful with language because words to me are things. And I think that in the world we live in, people are allowing the kind of like historically sort of preset boundaries to be more permeable. So we bring technology into our classrooms. We have students who come into discussions, or we have professors who come into lecture theaters or to classrooms, and they are heavily underpinned in their work by the use of tools, computers, cell phones, mobiles, iPads, Galaxy tablets, etc. ad nauseum. And so we've gone from kind of just people being together to people being together mediated in these spaces with tools which we are now heavily reliant on in many instances. And we see this reverberation back out in the world where some academics, as I understand it, are doing kind of the I want you to leave your tech at the door and you can come in with your kind of like quote old school paper and a pen, and we're going to have this revisiting of what the conditions we're going to work with in the classroom and the lecture theater are going to be like. And that has caused immense questions about who has the authority to declare the way in which the conditions will work together will be set. And to your point, it's never something where I want to hold up the professor and the student, or the formal and non-formal as these sort of absolute, sort of given uh, spaces. They are simply conventions that we rely heavily on in the literature. But now we're saying actually those categories are not solid, they are permeable. And they are not given, they are negotiated. And how do we have that negotiation? And what's the point of having the negotiation? Is it all for everybody to feel kind of warm and fuzzy? Or is there a direct expectation of how we will agree how we will be together if being together is the project?
And I think it's that dialogical or dialogal, sort of like the dialogue, right, that I'm hearing here in terms of, and also as I heard, I was listening to what you were sharing. So there's the what I call through Alan Rayner's of Dr. Alan Rayner's work, the flow forming into being and becoming, is
Mm,
that there is almost the contrast with sometimes how our rational, sort of like logical Cartesian sort of mind seems to think that there is this room and it's set, and tech no tech, tools no tools, like very like material, this is like a desk, all of those things, right?
yeah.
And almost a hyper focus on the material, as opposed to what you've described, which is like this flow forming into being and becoming. That means that for me, like I know after almost 300 imperfectly perfect, perfectly imperfect conversations, that every single one of them means that I come out a different person from the minute from when I started. So I know that after this conversation with you, or this, wandering I've done, like with the dog and Mother Earth and myself, I'm always changed. And yet, what happens in those liminal spaces, I don't know why we don't talk about that more, right? Like, and in a way, a lot of people often say of me, and like the conversations I have, that I'm very philosophical and I'm too deep. And I am a deep thinker. I am I philosophical? Yes, perhaps I am, but I wonder whether that's what's missing sometimes. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think this is a very important point because you highlight how my own hyper focus on the material, um, I think, Professor Leslie Gorley up at the Institute of Education raises this in a number of her articles. She says that our discussion about the digital infrastructure or the digital influence on the environments, learning environments, is preoccupied and focused on the materiality of those environments and completely absents, intentionally or unintentionally, the ethereal and ephemeral and the value of being. Going back to the original point in this conversation, like how far out of our bodies are we pulled by the subjecting of ourselves to that focus on the things we can materially measure, observe, experience, when in reality, for me, it is an expression of energy, how you express your energy. And questions of being in the world are fundamental to the reasons, in my mind, for participating in university, right? I mean, fundamentally doing your project on being and becoming. And like, these are very critical questions because we don't know the influence and value of them until nobody keeps that question alive in the conversation. If the question just gets pushed farther and farther from the core of purpose and meaning of the university, of participating in universities, of because a lot of the discourse and rhetoric now is around employability, value for money, key performance indicators, the metricizing of the universe in order to feel comfortable arguing with each other about why we do anything we do. And I would propose to you, just like the perfectly imperfect conversations, if you knew the ending of the story before you started writing it, why wouldn't you just hop to the end of the story? Like, what is the value of the intermediating spaces if we didn't know what surprise, delight we would experience? And really, I think we're after that understanding of our being. And for me, it is about recognizing the value and importance of that as a critical element of the project of being a university, of being a student or a staff in a university, and for the broader influence of those like social institutions and human social activity to the wider society within which they are situated. Because we we get, I think, pulled by a sort of tractor beam of energy to try to have to justify ourselves all of the time. And I think if we just get like um, obsessed with the justification, we miss the element of purpose and meaning, which is driving the the purpose of the project to begin with.
And I think I wonder, so this is something that I feel so also so strongly about, like I completely agree with you. And that being the being. Earlier on in the conversation, you were saying how, like, in a way, these conversations is also about knowing yourself, right? Like knowing who you are and what you are and what you bring to the conversations, because all of us in any given moment in time bring stuff in the room, right? Like the previous conversations, what has happened at breakfast, how well we slept, all of those things, right? And etc., etc. And I keep going back to this question because a lot of the work I do is around, well-being as a, I naively fell into my research in 2014, like I shared,
Mm,
because I arrived back at university and I was horrified by what I came back to with young people and their low subjective well-being, and how well-being, you were sort of talking about, for you, words are like are things and objects. I think
mm,
well-being is considered as an object in the world of psychology, and it's something we measure to its nth degree depending on how we look at it. And I became really curious because as I sort of naively went from, oh, I know, sort out the well-being of individuals will be sorted, to realizing that actually when you focus on maybe the well-being of young people, that impacts negatively the well-being of the staff.
mm,
That we never discussed the context and the environment, the impact of what's happening, or hence the project and what I'm doing right now, right?
mm,
I also shifted my mindset around well-being as an object to actually being well. So about being, right? And so I would also argue, because I'm interested in well-being being a Western concept, and being mainly coming from flourishing, which is the terminology I use, which is very much around, obviously positive psychology, which is also a very Western measure. Um, I'm now interested is like, what if it was being and not just being well? Because flourishing is not just about the blooming flower for me. Flourishing is about all the phases that a flower or a tree or an ecosystem has to go through to be this
mm,
particular ecosystem in a given moment in time.
mm,
So going back to like giving you all of that, I think, I'm really curious about that. It's like this being um is almost like, I keep wondering, why is it that as I grew up as a child who was being most of the time, being her. And I remember as a child, I was a loving child. I loved like having those, being in what I felt like those liminal spaces that I'm re-encountering.
mm,
And then slowly I feel like it's been taken away from me. And instead I've been given these programs to run that are very different from what I experienced as a child. And
mm,
so what if education was, rather than sort of going, oh well, you get educated to get a job, like you were saying, or the metrics, or to be a good little global citizen or contributing citizen in the world? What
mm.
if we actually educated with being at its core first? I mean,
Yeah.
does that make sense to you?
Yes. Yes. And I think what also you say and what I hear and what you're saying is being is about creative capacity. It's about how creativity was a primary way of being in the world. And then somewhere along the path, or somewhere along the adventure, rather, somebody told us, no, we have to justify that joy. Wait a minute, you have to justify your purpose. Oh, wait, you have to justify why you value these things. And because we have to be in society, and we go from these like originating conditions to these very hyper social, hyper complex, hyper aware spaces called society. And I remember, I mean, I grew up on a farm in Southern California. My father was a dairyman. My mother was a quote stay at home mother until I was, uh, well, in high school. And I think what I think you would call secondary school, pre collegiate. And I think that this also shows us, or what you mentioned also highlights for us, the contextual contingency of our values and principles, and of the way in which we architect values and principles and apply them, and the degree to which we feel we can, and the degree to which our systems can tolerate that liminal ambiguity or that differential. Because really, what we're asking in a sort of very core way to me is flourishing the ability to create oneself and to learn how creating oneself is interdependent with all of the ideas that are in our immediacy, 1 degree of freedom away from us, 2 degrees of freedom away from our tolerances, three, and to what degree will we say, okay, we will have a common agreement about being in societies, but we will defer or we will delegate our agency our responsibility never gets delegated. Our sense of self authority is never delegated, right? I mean, this is also a sort of huge thing you're saying is because I mean, I have a good friend. She just wrote a book called Frontier AI Security. It's Dr. Kirti Talam. She's in California at the um, she was originally at the Stanford, and she went to Lawrence Livermore Labs, and now she works for a company. But she talks about this, how in the current epoch of the world, we have a lot of systems that have been we have been trained into to delegate agency to. But that does not delegate our responsibility, and it does not delegate our sense of self. It simply delegates how we do certain behavior things. And your point is incredibly important because it says flourishing for many people is what you were born out of. And only along the way, when the sort of like we moved through systems society structured us in or with, sort of the guardrails of being with a broader spectrum of other beings, did we say, okay, well, we have to agree how we will build agreements. And that will emanate in this sort of like dialogue between the individual or the sense of the individual self and the broader society. And
Mm.
I think that that is a huge philosophical question that I don't think has yet to be resolved. I think maybe you would agree that like nobody has yet to say, when did you know? Nobody can answer that question because we're all adding sort of layers on top of this topography where we say, okay, this is how I learned, but when did you know? And
Yeah,
when did you unpack how you knew? And
yeah,
that question has driven philosophers to the nth degree of the universe for ages, right? So I'm just one person in a very long conversation about how being a human being can be or is, I think. And
yeah.
flourishing for me is at least the ability to participate in that conversation.
And I think flourishing for me is exactly that. So it's the way I describe it is flourishing is flowing with the ocean of life. That's how I would
Mm,
describe it. And
mm,
so that means that if you're flowing as a human being rather than a homo economicus, which is what we've been told we are, so we've forgotten that. I often sort of say we are called, and this is true also in French, it's être humain. So être, like to be, like the same with human being. In Spanish is ser humano, que is like ser, which is also to be. And it's not estar, it's ser, which is, if you know Spanish, means that it's literally nothing that changes depending on the conditions, right? It's like really who you are. And so
mm,
it goes to a word I keep circling back to, which is essence, like our
mm,
essence.
mm,
And so, like, more and more, I'm questioning this thing is like, why is it that as a child, I wasn't told more about the essence of who I am? Because if I'd been told the essence of who I am, as a unique ecosystem that I am, I wouldn't find myself age 50 having to have therapy because I'm now diagnosed as neurodivergent, and
mm,
because the system that pathologizes and that likes to make you disabled and all of those things, right?
mm,
um Perhaps I would not have needed that, right? Because I would have been allowed to be Fabienne, this human being, going back to not like human doing,
mm,
primarily, or Homo economicus, which is what I feel I'm slowly unlearning, because that's what I feel my journey, particularly, the last 5 years. It's been true since I became a mum 18 years ago, but very
mm,
much the last 5 years when I sort of said, okay, I can't continue post COVID with being a language teacher. I just need more. um, there's been a lot of unlearning and going back to this question, well, who is Fabian? Who is, who am I? What am I? What's my essence? What's like and I don't know whether that's going to resonate with you or not, but I feel like I'm shedding a lot in the process.
The, like to your point of unlearning, to your point of just earlier reflexivity and being reflective, and having the space to ask that question and to use how you understand the answer as an open and emergent and ever complexifying thing. To say about space, the poetics of it, to use the work of someone like Gaston Bachelard, right, who was the doctoral student of Auguste Comte, right, in Paris, originally a post person from the south of France, who came to be a huge mind around asking, if nothing is given and everything is created, then helping the person create themselves. The willingness to be so self-aware as to be able to have an intentional or purposeful contribution to how others co-create or how others collaborate. And then a willingness to say, well, why do I bring this person to the table all the time? And how do you do that without going sort of so far you fall back into yourself to a place that feels like you would have to spend another lifetime to walk out of that? Yeah. And you go, well, I've, I would say what my parents have always said, everybody is doing the best they can where they are with what they have at all times. If you would like people to expect you to be doing the best you can where you are at all times, you must first extend that in the world, because it's that call that leads to the response you were aiming for. Now, I believe in that. I believe in that so fundamentally that it has shaped the ecology of my ideas for, I mean, 20 plus years, yeah, since I left my home
Mm.
since I left the farm. But I think I carry those people with me. As Dr. Maya Angelou said, I carry everybody who has ever been kind to me with me. I believe in the world to be a place that has always the opportunity to be um, kind to itself, kind with itself. I think that very often these days, we don't spend time on the value of that. We spend time on the short term gratification of getting what we want now, getting a clear answer now, and we often don't um, persist or persevere in this feeling that everybody is always doing the best they can. Everybody is always doing the best they can. They're starting from a different position than I am because they are experiencing the world that we share in their way. And how do we experience this together without collapsing each other, defining each other, a priori, just being present with each other? And I keep, to your point, I keep coming back to this point of like the most important thing I've learned over the last, say, decade, 15 years since I started the doctorate in 2013 is the importance and value of being present and of trying to work as I can to stay present. Hence why we like liminal space, hence why we do these sort of garden walks and coffee talks and imperfectly perfect conversations, because that bringing ourselves to being present has an invaluable value, an ethereal or ephemeral value to us that we want to be reminded of as an important um, opportunity or value to play in our daily lives. I mean, this is the work of Henri Lefebvre, right? It's the daily rhythms and routines and rituals, and how those daily rhythms and routines and rituals are in no small proportion shaped by the kind of importance we give to being present.
And I love that, because I call that presencing, as in,
Mm,
and I
mm,
really also like it, because presencing means like there's the present, being here and now, but also like it's a gift.
Mm,
And the more, so I describe that as holding the space, as in, like, being a space
mm,
holder. um so particularly, like, at the minute, because I'm about to embark on my field work, and so we're going through the inviting the young people to participate, etc., and that
mm,
takes time. So I've been going in the school informally to just get to be presencing in the school, and just sort of like going, hey, this is me. And so, and as we're talking, I think what I'm reminded of is that in this presencing, there's also like a building of trust of, people seeing you and feeling like, because to have those imperfectly perfect, perfectly imperfect conversations, I think there's something we haven't addressed, um, which is around my own experience, is sort of like when I don't feel safe and secure, and I don't feel there is trust, that ethereal that you talked about, the energetic. I think over the years, I learned to just go close my heart, and
mm,
that somehow makes me almost go back in my body, and going back to what we described earlier on, which is I'm a human, and I don't feel safe here. And so,
mm,
therefore, then you go back to, oh, but I need to protect myself. And the opposite for me of flourishing is being in survival. And when you're
mm.
in survival, of course, you know, you're there, the material is what you focus on, rather than, like, if that makes sense. Does that make sense to you?
100%. Because you take yourself, if you don't feel safe, you look at the common in the material around you in order to justify whether or not you stay, you stay or go. You stay or go in presence. And I think that trust is the outcome of feeling like a valued person. Like, I think that before trust is possible, you have to feel like somebody recognizes you, you feel seen, you feel heard, and you feel held, or you feel like somebody has held the space. This is such a beautiful and important way of describing what I think a researcher can do, what I think a teacher does, and a professor does, what TAs do, what administrators do, what people who maintain buildings do. They maintain the container of our being in places where everybody keeps up with this idea or value that we value each other, and we express that valuing in the ways we can. For some people, their responsibility is to make sure that the environment is clean. For others, it's to make sure that they're holding the space whereby we're debating these ideas, not as given and absolutes again, but as open and emergent concepts humans use in order to create, co-create, collaborate or not, do other versions of that. I mean, we have this understanding of engagement that moves from inform people about what you will do to co-create with them, because you bring them from before you even ask your question into how the question itself is shaped. And that environmental condition changes dynamics around how people understand their situatedness in the environs they're sharing. And I think this is a really important point, because we have delegated that authority to the researcher who is doing the study. Your fieldwork will be in places where you will have spent time before you even ask these other questions. And that intentionality shapes and changes the way in which people are able to answer. And I think you know this. I mean, you've experienced this, I'm sure, or maybe you can say. But like, I think that is a really very important sort of understanding or starting or departure of going in to do your work and your field work is really sort of understanding as someone who cares about human flourishing, that in order for flourishing to be possible in your lens, there has to be a degree of recognizing everybody before they even know that they weren't recognized, right? That is really, for me, that kind of pivotal question of like, right, so you knew before anybody could ask how it could be different, that it could be this way and it could be different. And anyway, and like, if that makes any sense. And so really you're intentional about how you shape, how you go into the space and how you sustain space.
Yeah, yeah, completely, completely. Yes, that makes complete sense to me. Because for
Mm,
me, it's um, and I think what I see as a result is I've been going informally to talk to people and to introduce myself, and they're now all going, any chance I can have a chat with Fabienne? As in, this is not data collection. This isn't, it's never going to be part of the project. But it's like what you said. I think for me, when you hold the space, and when I say hold the space, that's a metaphorical, sort of image, right? Um,
mm,
it's like I'm reminded of Parker Palmer talking talking trust circles, right? Like this whole idea, or what I'd like to use for the as a tool for the research, the talking circles. So the way we hold the space is, for me, what you said. It's like I I look at everybody, and for everybody, I think, well, we all have a right to be here. We are here. If we are here, that means you are meant to be here. And going back to what you were saying about our purpose, and I think for me that's that inner power that we all have, and that, like, sort of
mm,
the right to shine and to share your gift for
mm,
the world, right? So I think the reason we're here in this world in terms of flourishing is, I often think, oh, if I had been, I mean, there's no point in regretting, but like, because I felt so much better with who I am right now, and
mm,
that's made me the person I am, able to do the research I'm doing. But I just think, imagine if we had a world where the young people grow, come into this world with adults who see them for the unique ecosystem that they were born to be and become. And
mm,
not with, like, I know what ecosystem you are, but with curiosity, which is
mm,
like, who are you? What are you? What makes you tick? What makes you afraid? What are your strengths, your challenges? Like, when you flow form with the world, into being and becoming, with that dance, right? Like with the ocean of life. That literally, the water, the ocean of life, it's water sculpts, right? Like it creates the meandering of a river or an ocean or whatever.
mm.
And so I keep going back to that. It's like every time you hold the space, people sort of go, there's always a, oh, thank you, because it's almost like, somehow, like you were saying, people have this space where they feel seen, heard, and held, and they're like, oh, okay, I didn't even know that's what I wanted to talk about, or this is like. So is that also your experience when you have those, like, talking cafes and
I hope so. I can't say, because I think also, like, I recognize fully that's a privilege for me. The privilege of knowing that I am safe or feeling safe.
yeah.
And maybe that's because I've interpreted it as a privilege because I have experienced moments in life when I didn't feel like 100% safe. And so that drew me to ask, why is that contrast? What does that contrast do? What work does the contrast do in shaping the conditions people work in? So I became very, to your earlier point of the materiality, I became very preoccupied or concerned with the material environment because I noticed how different material environments did or didn't allow for the sense of people to feel safe and or they kind of scripted the way the world was. And I'm like, but the open space is invaluable because it's not full. Like, you don't know the value of the open space until you fill it with something and declare it will be so. And then you can't unpack that or get out of that because you've put the parking lot, you've put the concrete or the asphalt down, you've built the structure, and you've said that's the way it's going to be. And the fun thing about universities to me, or the fun thing about classrooms to me, is that they are these material environments, but they're infused with this idea or this awareness that they are the open spaces, or the unscripted spaces, the liminal spaces, where ideas are still the primary reason we gather, the primary reason we are gathered, the primary reason we come together is because learning is part of being human. And learning is by definition change, which means we're going to have to stay open and curious. And we have to make being open and curious something we can feel safe doing and being, because a lot of what I find happening around me often is a lot of people working to overcome the feeling they are not safe, working to overcome the feeling they have to constantly justify. Now, that happens for a large number of reasons, for a complex number of reasons in the world. But if we mean that places like schools and universities are still sort of these liminal spaces where the questions and the ability to ask the question and to um, develop one's curiosity and capacity to create um, is invaluable. It doesn't have to have um, an outcome attached to it. Outcomes do nothing but degrade its importance. That you go, ah, so, and then you begin to ask yourself, in my mind, flourishing as the capacity to create in co-creation, the capacity to ask the question and not um, uh, be defined or worried about the outcome of the answer. You want to, it's like the old Hippocratic oath: first do no harm to others and do no harm to yourself. First do no harm to you and do no harm to others. And then go do anything else you have time for. But if you start every day, like I meditate every morning when I get up. I do Duolingo now for 15 minutes every morning, and I meditate with one of those apps every morning. And I try to give myself that moment of from opening my eyes to being in the world, so that I have an awareness of transitioning from the last time I closed my eyes to the first time I open them again. And that sort of way of understanding how coming into space helps create it, um, and and how safe it is for one to think and act for themselves, and how safe it is for one to think and act for themselves in cooperation or in interdependent relations. I think, and as you said earlier, being a global citizen, for some may be the project. For others, it may be that I want to go and get a fabulous job and I want to own a lot of fabulous cars and live in fabulous houses, or travel the world and have no attachment to any of those materialities ever, always. Yeah. And you go, wait a second, we now live in a society and worlds where that's possible, and the judgment and stigma of the thing doesn't bear as much weight on the person being and doing. And you get the sense that, like, so we can do this. So it's possible. And we create possibilities. We create more possibilities because we realize that the possibility is actually what we were after: the feeling of possibility, the feeling of creating, and the value we give to the feeling as much as we give to the thinking of doing. I don't know if that resonates.
Clearly that resonates. And I think what you pointed to at the beginning, like that position of privilege, is perhaps something that we've not addressed, and that
Mm,
I see a lot, like that I also wanted to address with like positive psychology and the
mm,
decolonizing of positive psychology, as in like flourishing as something you measure, and
mm,
bringing the relational well-being from White and Jar, from the majority global south, because I think one thing we haven't discussed is that certainly for us in the UK, to go to university, it requires some privilege because of the cost. Okay, like how much it costs to go to university, and
mm,
the additional cost of like uh you know obviously accommodation if you live far away from home, all of those things.
mm,
That's a really important point. And also the fact that, if I'm talking about well-being in a school, and there are in the UK more and more children who arrive in school, in primary and secondary school, without having had a food, a breakfast. So I often sort of like also acknowledge the fact that I'm not privileged because I can go out. I'm safe enough. Like my most basic needs of a roof over my head and a fridge with food and water has completely
mm,
been addressed. When
mm,
for many it isn't, right? And
mm,
there's also an element around like universities where initially created, I mean, certainly like the first university here in England was created by white men for privileged white men. Like we have to address that, right? And
mm.
sort of talk about the baked social injustices that keep also being reproduced, if that makes sense.
Well, and we get caught in that project of our participation on those terms reproduces and replicates that in a historical sense repeatedly, right? I mean, we by contributing into the structure replicate that. I mean, c'est on Michel Foucault, yeah? I mean, Foucault says this all the time, like social institutions reproduce those like differences, or if you will, uh, differentiated classes. It's a classist system. To your point, I mean, Oxford was originally created because the king decided he wanted the aristocracy who were being trained to be clergy to stay in house, to stay in England. Yeah. I mean, setting aside the universities in Scotland, setting aside the university in Wales, Northern Ireland, all of the places where, you know, like, I mean, you had the first university out of, I believe, northern Morocco. I don't recall its exact name. And then you had Bologna, and then you had the University of Paris, and then you have Oxford. And then Oxford shows up, and it's like, well, this was created so that a very thin minority of the world could gain access to preset like resources and preset influence in the world. And then as we progressed, we moved from Oxford and Cambridge in the UK, right, to which you had then University College London, and you had a number of civic universities and red brick universities, and then we had non-universities and further education institutions, and then you had post 1992s, and then you had all of these people going, the more and more further out gambles we take, we arrive back to the precise place we started, which is this is for us to know what in the world. This is for us to do what in the world. And when we grow up with this expectation that participation is a necessary element of life, of being in society, because we are told if you don't do these things, then you are second class. You will be classified as having not totally figured out the quote game of it all. Everybody wants to talk about this as a life is a game. I don't think so. I think life is about the emergence and complexity of energy from a source energy that became before words all the way out and further out gambles with itself. And that people reflect that or they don't. because there's like this frustration that you note, like the privilege is, well, if this is so important in society, why does it feel like it becomes so complicated and so costly and so, and then, you have other environments, to your point of the student residences. Student residences used to be part of the economic revenue generation and socialization of the university. Now, since early 2000s in the UK, they're talked about as services provided to customers called students by institutions called universities. And then everybody goes, okay, well, if you're a customer and a provider relationship, how does that change the dynamic of the educational value and contribution? Well, these are still places where people, as I have learned, value the social and the personal space in those places. They carve out that as being invaluable. And so for me, the question then sort of presents itself, well, who's to say? And what does not respecting that privilege do to the repetition of it in the future? And do you go back to a, you know, university grants committee kind of situation where universities get block grants and things like students' housing and food become simply an extension of what participating in university is? Okay, but for broader society, do you give every person of majority at the age of majority when they reach it the same resources to build their life as if they were in the same sort of spaces? I mean, we haven't really interrogated that at all, because if we had to do that, we'd say, well, there is a baked in differentiated advantage, if you will, when you live in a society where going to university gives you auto access to resources that not going to university does not. And by way of finances or social capitals or personal capitals, I mean, it's Foucault and
And it's
Bourdieu and all that.
Bourdieu, yeah, that's it.
It's Bourdieu
You're
goes,
easy.
and then you go crazy, and then you go, oh, and then everybody listening to this goes, wait a second, let's just slow down, and then you go, actually, we can't slow down because we can't be anywhere but where we are. And at least we're acknowledging that we recognize those privileges. To your point, you recognize that having clean water, access to a full fridge, access to a shelter, and an awareness, at least you built a sense of awareness. And that awareness allowed you to determine in yourself how much allowing you will offer the rest of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, even etc. Does that
And
makes
then also it just means that you can then give from the position of privileged, and and do what you can do with the resources that you have, right? Because that's what you can only ever do. And if nothing else, I think just addressing those conversations is a really important point, because like you were saying, you can't slow down. I think for me, like those liminal spaces, they felt like I have slowed down, if nothing else, my thinking
Mhm.
through the presencing, in a sense that actually perhaps all it takes is like you maybe you just sort of thread the needle a little bit, one imperfectly perfect conversation at a time. And so the more we have those conversations, the more we can start questioning things and highlighting, because the reality, like Foucault and Bourdieu talk about, like the habitus and the cultural capital, and like the fact that, like what you pointed to, is that if you are, so I think for me as a white working class woman who was told by her dad, if you don't want to be like your mum working in a supermarket, you need to go and get degrees. And like the this idea that you can climb the social ladder, and make your way up, right? Like I often joke and say I made my way up the greasy pool of like management in higher education or in education, right?
Mhm.
You don't talk about the damages that does to a white working class female, for example, or like that's
Mhm.
therefore the unlearning because of
Mhm.
what I took on. But those conversations like the one we're having, that might make us actually address that, the fact that it's not seen, we don't, like it's part of the systemic or the makeup of what looks like life and social sort of settings, and then suddenly you can talk about all of that, and maybe through that presencing we can address, I'm hoping, in a way, like with the PhD, we're going to be addressing the drivers that foster and hinder our being well or not, or everything in between. And I think that hopefully that something might emerge of that, or not, but at least it's being addressed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think also what I hear and what you point out is you recognize you inherit something. And I would say, I would propose there was a lot I inherited that I didn't build. I had no influence over. What I created out of that inheritance, rather, is what I define as my life. So again, it goes back to that capacity, creating the capacity to create and to do so intentionally. And to your point, to say, like, right, so I didn't build the roads, I didn't build the school, I didn't set these conditions. And at the same time, I have this level of influence in myself in how I understand the world and then how I express that understanding with the world. And to your earlier point of being both the wave and the ocean, to understand one is the, sort of like peak and trough of it all. And the like willingness to have that awareness. I think that was really what we were after. I won't speak for you, but I was really after that sense of like, ah, so that's what allows me to be, is that sense of like, and I come from this sort of like metaphysical logic where I'm like, I was born into conditions not of my choosing. I will exit at a time not of my choosing under normal circumstances. And in the interim, my responsibility, and it is a responsibility to the world, because it's a political act. We are political, whether or not we agree, disagree, contest, whatever. We are political creatures. That is an awareness of our responsibility to each other and ourselves, or the sense of self with others, about why we do and what we do and how we do that. And I think that's why, like, I always really valued the work of people like Gaston Bachelard, because as I followed the idea, to your point, of capitals all the way back. I started with certain authors, I just found through my own exploration. And I kept asking, well, where did that idea build from? And then I went all the way back and all the way back as far as I could with the time I had. And then I had to stop. And then I went forward and I was like, okay. So this is how it's constructed, or so I would call it socially constructed or socially co-created. And that I think is a really, it's humility. It is a humility in the world. I I don't think anybody would ever accept me as a quite humble person. No, anybody would be like, "Oh yeah, Zach, he's so humble." I think they would say maybe he learned some humility through the privilege and the pleasure of being able to do those things. Because, as you say, it is a privilege. I I don't think that the person I grew up as could have known I would move to London and get a doctorate with Professor Vincent Carpentier and Dr. Brian Cunningham, and meet all the people from all of the places of the world that I had the privilege of sitting next to and sharing table with. And then take these liminal walks into spaces with just the intention of being with people because I valued being with them. Um, and finding that as I did that, I as a person became more human. And I was really after being as human and as for want of terms, as good a human as I could be. And I always found that being with people helped that as I went. Mm.
It's beautiful, and it shines through, like in the
Mm.
conversations we're having. So yeah,
Mm.
I completely get that. Oh wow, yes. And as you were sharing, I think perhaps that's all we can ever do, in a way, is
Mm.
perhaps that's just what it is about. It's like having the what you've described is, for me, what I've experienced, which is, you know I am constantly flow forming into being and becoming, um, through every single imperfectly perfect conversation and encounter.
Mm,
And the word you use, like responsibility, I think I'm reminded of, or every time when I use that word, because some people sometimes find it jarring, I always think of Viktor Frankl and Man's
mm,
Search for Meaning. And
mm,
how, you know, the responsibility, our ability to choose our response, and the way he describes, and within that space, and
mm,
there's that space, between the stimulus and the response, there's a space, so back to that space, liminal space, right, where thereby we can choose our response, and that's where lies our like our freedom, right? um
mm,
and so I don't know, like what you shared, I'm not surprised, like, I felt like the connection I felt when I met you, and still today, like an hour and a half later, like this beautiful conversation, because I think it is in that responsibility. So perhaps what it is that
mm,
we can all decide how we show up in the world.
mm. Yes, and I think I couldn't say it better. I mean, to your point, being in the presence of someone who allows you to feel a sense of flourishing in yourself and a sense of being in yourself, and someone who hears you and sees you and holds the space for you as you have offered today to me is like an incredibly important, because it becomes part of how we reset or we understand what's possible. And Victor, I think to your point about Viktor Frankl's work, that response between the stimulus and the outcome of our decision is that liminal space where whereby we express ourselves, and we have that moment of conscious or unconscious awareness or unawareness of knowing that that possibility and that space is something afforded, or we create, or we co-create. And then yeah, I couldn't say it better. Like I mean, it's an absolute joy and an absolute privilege to be here. But also, like, you can tell, like, as Franco noted, that we relate to and resonate with, um, our work and our relationships and our co-creativity, and a sense of responsibility or response in abilities, as we go. Yeah.
Amazing. So, Zach, I'm wondering, is there a question I haven't asked you and you're like, oh, I so wish Fabian had asked me about this? Or
Well, can I ask you a question?
yeah.
Like, what do you hope will be the contribution of your fieldwork in in the research area in human flourishing and education? Like,
Okay.
what is your yeah, what
That's
is your fieldwork
it.
for?
Thank
Go
you.
for it. Yeah.
I think I haven't started yet, so it's sort of like you imagine things, and so um, I I would like my contribution to be a contribution to the specifically the world of education,
Mm,
um, as an invitation for space holding. So I'm hoping that perhaps what my work will do is get more of us to pause, and because the world of education, certainly my experiences of space, educational settings, let's call them, for a
mm,
better world, lack of better words, is full of busybodies, um, almost like a little hamster on the hamster wheel. And I can talk about that because that's who I was 5 years ago, eight
mm,
years ago, going on my hamster wheel, going nowhere, but constantly busy and not having time. And so, to your question, what I'm hoping is that perhaps my PhD will be a tiny little, um, gap in that busyness, and an invitation to just pause and
Mm.
bring I mean, I guess like at the moment, the working title of the PhD is Space to Be and Become Together. And so perhaps that's all it will do, is sort of like what happens when we give ourselves permissions to create spaces where we can be and become together and flow forward
Mm.
into that being and becoming. Um, I think if my work does that, I'll be happy with.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you act as a placeholder or a reminder, like that's what I think really is powerful about your work, is that it reminds us at a time that feels so rhetorically and discourse consumed by um, a lot of metricizing and a lot of justification, like actually just being and recognizing the shaping of being and the shaping of becoming. um, that sense of being and sense of transformation are still invaluable questions for people to have the space for as they go through all the things they are going to go through. Because much of that will not be predictable, much of that will not be given, much of that will be co created. And that willingness to begin from the questions of being and becoming again, I think is an incredibly powerful opportunity for everyone who will encounter you and your research as you go.
Thank you. I think, yeah, and I think for me, what it does when we do that is that it prevents us from feeling that we have to compete with one another, and feeling that, like, wondering, oh, this person is doing a similar work from mine, so therefore I should be frightened by them or fearful of them, or, and therefore, moving on from doing the PhD, my heart has always been into creating a mycelial network of
Mm,
education. And so perhaps what I'm hoping is that I can then, using the PhD as the basis and the foundational sort of evidence for space to be and become, that perhaps slowly and surely I can contribute to be almost a counter dialogue or conversation for the neoliberal capitalist system that tells us we have to be be in the world differently than perhaps we were meant to be.
mm,
And if I can manage even a tiny bit to remove the competitiveness and the fear of failure and the perfectionism and and an
mm,
invitation to have more imperfectly perfect conversations throughout the world. And
mm,
for the reason I do the podcast is I view it as this is an opportunity to hold a space and shine a light on Dr. Zachery Spire, so that people who resonate with what you shared can find you away from like the noise of the internet. And so I guess that's what I'd love. Like,
mm,
if I die tomorrow, I really hope that when people listen to this podcast, they'll go, "Oh, maybe Fabian did that a little bit, right?" Like, that'll be my
mm.
contribution to the world, and I'll be really happy.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, and I think as being on the other side of that conversation, for having the opportunity, me and the hundreds of people who come before me, and the likely hundreds of people who I hope come after me, as you keep these conversations going, it offers us a reflection, a point of reflection and reflexivity, and that uh, it's so nice to have somebody who creates the space and sustains that space for us. And as you say, like a counterbalance or a counterweight to the neoliberal, hyper metricized, hyper accomplished focus, because I find cooperation and collaboration and co creation give me as much as competition does without the isolation or the atomizing of myself in the world.
Yes.
I feel like that's really what I get to at the end, is I don't have to feel so alone, and I can get a beautiful, brilliant opportunity to live my life with people rather than act as if somehow I was born into nothing and I have just had to crawl myself out of the darkness, and prove my worth, justify my value. I mean, I don't know if the universe needs me to do that. And I personally prefer cooperation and collaboration and co creation and building the capacity to do that well, to do that wellness in my being, to be well with, rather than be well in spite of or etc. I think
Yeah,
this is very helpful.
completely. And I think for me, more and more, that co-creation I call companionship.
Mm, yes.
It's like,
And we are just friends on the way to finding each other. I mean,
exactly. And
to,
Ram Dass's quote, we are on all just walking each other home. So
Fabia, I couldn't have said it any other way better. I can't tell you, like, literally when you just said that, that's the person who rose up in my brain. It was like, a la Richard Alpert, a la Ram Dass. It was like,
yeah,
we're all just walking each other home.
yeah.
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 And crab. Good.
Amazing. So Zach, we've meandered beautifully together and walked together, I mean, I feel so energized and nourished by our conversation. So I want to start by
Same.
saying thank you. Um,
Thank you.
but I'd like to ask you one final question, if I may, which is the question I ask all of my guests before we finish, which is, for you, is there anything in particular that you're taking away from this conversation, or you want to leave us with, and both, because it doesn't have to be one or the other ever. Is there anything that stands out for you?
I think just a deep appreciation of how this imperfectly perfect conversation allows us to find within each other so many of those points of departure that we individually bring and then find common ground or common opportunity to reflect and share with someone who we meet through happy accidents. I mean, I think that I just would say that we met because we crossed paths through a BERA conference, but through kind of a focus on or an interest in a similar project, being and well-being and flourishing in environments, particularly universities and schools, and the just how invaluable I hope we all know this is for all of us. That just having the chance to do this, I think that feeling heard, and so having such appreciation for being able to contribute, and to start my day so fabulously with you, Fabian, is just just something I would say I really appreciate. Just thanks so much for allowing me to have the space, creating and sustaining that space, and allowing me to contribute into the garden of ideas you have in order to to keep being and flourishing as we go.
Thank you. It's been a real delight for sure.
Same,
I've loved every minute.
same. Thanks you very much.
Thank you.